All right. This is session number 14. I erroneously said last time was number 12. It actually was 13, and that makes this number 14 in our series on biblical backgrounds. I'm Dr. John McMath, together with my friends in Italy and in the Philippines, and we're looking at the background of the Bible as given to us by geography, by archaeology, by written history, all the different sources that are outside of our Bibles that help us to understand better what's going on in the biblical world. Today we'll be doing what I call the early divided kingdom. Okay, 931 to 841 BC. So not very long, about 100-year period that represents a division of the southern kingdom of Judah from the northern kingdom that we're going to call Israel throughout the rest of the Old Testament. The two kingdoms are fundamentally different. They're alike in a lot of ways, but they're fundamentally different. The southern kingdom of Judah, from the time of David and Solomon, will maintain a single dynasty, one line of kings, all the way down to the Babylonian captivity. So there is one line of kings, and that kingly line is the line of Christ. Now, of course, David knew this, I think, and probably Solomon knew this, but most of the other southern kings really had little understanding of their place in history. The northern kings, on the other hand, were uniformly bad guys. The southern kings were a mixed bag. There were some good kings like Solomon and some really bad kings. Jehu was kind of halfway in between. He wasn't really evil, but he certainly wasn't a good guy. And we get this mixture all the way through the northern kingdom, well up through the southern kingdom. There's some good kings in the south. In the north, there were never any good kings. The other difference in the north is that the dynasties were short-lived. I've forgotten how many dynasties there were during the roughly 200 years that the northern kingdom existed. I believe there were 9 or 12 dynasties. So a king would reign and his son would reign after him, and then that king would be assassinated and replaced by his assassin, who'd start a new dynasty that lasts for 2 or 3 kings, and then that one would be deposed or exiled or assassinated and replaced by somebody else even more evil. And none of them were worth the powder to blow them up, and none of them were good guys. There were no good northern kings. There were some good southern kings. The general dating, the division between north and south, takes place at 930 or 31 BC, the end of the life of Solomon. We've got the 2 kings. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and he was not a good man. Matter of fact, he was a really bad man, and his policies led directly to the split between the north and the south. So the northern kings started off with Jeroboam the first. And Jeroboam was, of course, a thoroughly bad man. But he had what we Westerners would call conservative policies about economics. And he believed that there should be a relatively lower tax rate, and that people should keep more of the money, actually produce, that they produced. And so Jeroboam was right about some things, but he was mostly wrong. He was a pragmatist and an idolater. And the two nations are going to split apart. During the 200 years that the Northern Kingdom existed separately, they were alternately at war or at peace with the Southern Kingdom. And the two, Israel and Judah, were also alternately at war or at peace with the surrounding nations. And often they'd be in alliance with one another or in alliance with some foreign nation against one another. And it makes for a remarkably complex mess. takes a lot of the fun out of studying Old Testament history because it gets really, really complicated. The good news is that for the most part, as students, we don't have to keep track of all of it. It's possible when doing a study in a portion of the Old Testament kings to dig in real deep. And there's a surprising amount of information about the periods of individual kings and their interactions with foreign nations. The Bible gives us a great deal of detail. And it's possible using the history books and the archaeology books to track down an enormous amount of detail. I'll show you a bunch of it, but rest assured there's a whole bunch more. And it's possible to go very, very, very deep. That can be kind of fun. Sometimes that works in a sermon for those of you who are preaching regularly. Sometimes it works, sometimes it pays off. I've discovered most of the time that a fairly limited depth of knowledge is all that we really need, all that most students really need in this area. We've got a bunch to choose from. So I'll give you a little selection. Let's share the screen. We'll start with the early divided kingdom. Let's make sure I get the correct one. All right. Is it working? Yes, it is working. Okay, early divided kingdom from 931 to 841 BC, for about 100 years. I call this the house divided, where Israel is divided north from south. Something that fits right into this period is the Gezer calendar. This is a schoolboy's exercise tablet. We don't know who the student was, but schoolboy learning his ABCs, and this is a calendar of what happens each month of the agricultural year. March, his time is planting. Okay, April, his time is raining. It's an interesting little exercise, but what makes it really fun is that this is our earliest known copy of the Paleo-Hebrew script, the early Hebrew script. This is sometimes called the Angular script. Later on, during the Babylonian captivity, the Hebrew language would be transferred over into what we call the Aramaic or square script that we find in modern Hebrew Bibles. But this is the old so-called archaic or ancient script. And what makes it really, really valuable is that it is an alphabet. It doesn't look like an alphabet, I know. But each of those little squiggles is a separate letter. There are no vowels. Sometimes consonants like W and Y and Aleph are used like vowels, but there are no vowels. Everybody just knew how to pronounce the words. There are no word divisions, so you just had to know. It goes from right to left and from the top of the page to the bottom, just like a modern Hebrew Bible. The characters themselves can be traced back to the very first alphabet ever found in the whole world, which really only dates back about 1,000 years before this Gezer calendar was made. Around 1800 BC, some of the Hebrews who were sojourning in Egypt worked for the Pharaoh in the copper mines in Sinai. The southwestern side of the Sinai Peninsula, the lower Sinai Peninsula, is quite rich in minerals, still is today. And the Egyptians knew that, and they had copper mines in several places along the western coast of the Sinai. One of the reasons that many of us think the southern Sinai is the best place to look for Mount Sinai is that this is an area that was fairly well known by many generations of Hebrew workmen. And these miners went out into the field knowing Egyptian, of course, but they also had their own Hebrew language. They were Hebrews and they stayed Hebrew the whole time that they were in Egypt. While they were in the copper mines, they occasionally needed to communicate with one another or to make some kind of an inscription. So we find inscriptions in the copper mines. Some of those inscriptions are in the hieroglyphic script of Egypt, and others, a grand total of 250 some separate inscriptions, are an alphabetic script that has some relationship to the hieroglyphic shapes and some relationship to the cuneiform shapes of Mesopotamia, but is clearly alphabetic. There are only 26 letters in this alphabet. And the archaeologists who first saw this recognized immediately that this is an alphabetic language. And it didn't take very long for them to recognize that this is related to the biblical Hebrew. The Sinai script and the Gezer calendar script are not identical. Things change over 1,000 years, but they're close enough that you can see the relationship. So it's actually possible to argue that the the oldest alphabet in the world, the first alphabet, was written by Israelite copper miners in the Egyptian Sinai during the time of the sojourn in Egypt. That's all told, that's a fascinating story. I've got a book here on my shelf about the world's earliest alphabet by a relatively young scholar who's been doing this work for a while. Okay, so this gives us just a little insight. There it is. Here's the kingdom being divided because of Rehoboam. Rehoboam refused to lower taxes, which is always stupid. Jeroboam was a usurper. He was not a legitimate king, but he was ready to assume the control of the northern kingdom when the revolt happened. So as a result of that, Jeroboam went off and started his own separate thing. His capital would be in the northern city of Shechem. And one of the first things that Jeroboam did was to try to wean the people of Israel away from Jerusalem as the center for worship. He did this by building temples to a golden calf, an idol, at Bethel, the southernmost city of the northern kingdom, and Dan, which, as you'll recall from the book of Judges, is way, way up in the north. Dan is a city built on the headwaters of the Jordan River in the foothills of Mount Hermon, way up in the north. And interestingly, at Tel Dan, we have found a temple. This is the high place at Dan. No such similar golden calf temple has been found at the conventional or popular site of Bethel. There's an Arab village called Baitin that does in fact have a major tell that really should be Bethel, but we've never found a golden calf temple there. There's no indication at all that it was a major royal city. Some scholars, conservatives who believe that the Bible is true, continue to look for Bethel. And there are some possibilities, but all of them are in the West Bank Palestinian controlled territories. It's very difficult to dig there. We rarely have opportunities. So we may never know for sure about the golden calf temples at Bethel, but we've got this one here. And let me show you just a little bit. The upper left just shows some of the archaeological area. The lower right shows you how this area looks fairly recently. This photo was taken about 10 years ago and shows the overall area. You see a young man climbing up a step just to the right of that fence. And the first thing on the left is a laver. It looks like just a big well, but it's not a well at all. It was a tank for holding water. And the idea is that you go there and you wash your hands. All of the temples that we're going to see in Israel for whatever god they might have worshipped have some kind of provision for a laver. If you go to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem today, you'll find Muslims washing their hands and feet before they go in. This is a universal thing. People seem to have an understanding that they are unclean in the presence of God and need to wash up. The metal structure that you see in the lower right photograph is a modern reconstruction of the size and shape of a bronze altar. It obviously wasn't made of aluminum, and we don't know for sure the exact size and shape, but the structure is about right. So a horned altar made of cut stones, because obviously the Israelites were cutting their stones, and a substantial altar that may have been of stone or it may have been of bronze. We don't know because it's completely gone. Behind that, under that big spreading oak tree, is the high place itself where the golden calf temple would have been located. I've got some more pictures of this particular place. And to make that happen, I have to stop that share. actually make this go away. And then I have to share a different screen. See if I can make this happen. Oh, maybe I can make this happen. Oh, look at that. How about that? All right, then I'll have to get out of this thing again, but that's not that big a problem. Okay, this is a close-up of that laver that I mentioned. It doesn't look like much, does it? It looks like it ought to be a well, but it really isn't. It's just a fixture for ritual washing. One of the details that we find all over the ancient world, whether that's around the Mediterranean, places like Greece and Italy, or in Asia Minor, in the Hittite country, or in places like Syria and Lebanon, Israel itself, all the way down into Egypt, parts of North Africa, where we find ancient temples. We find some kind of a washing facility. This is a very common thing. And there it is. That thing is about 2 meters in diameter, about 1 meter high. So people could walk up to it and dip their hands into the water. The priests would have been required to keep that water replenished. And I can imagine if a big crowd of people came through, that the water would get pretty dirty pretty quickly. So I'm not entirely sure I would want to be the priest whose job it was to keep that water clean. Nevertheless, the ritual cleaning would be done right there. This is a group I was leading, walking up those steps, past the laver, up to the altar itself. And you can see the size of that altar. It would have been a very large thing. The altar was designed to be visible from a long way off. This was not designed as a place where people would congregate to listen to a sermon. I mean, what's the priest going to say about a golden calf anyway? The idol is up higher at the top of the steps, and here we have the one access to the steps. I'll show you another picture here in just a second. Yeah, there we go. These steps will take us up from the altar area. You can see it on the left, to the right, and then left, and up another layer of steps. Because everybody knows that God is up high and believers are down low. So people from a distance, well outside of the temple, would watch the priests go through the ritual of walking into the sacred area, washing, taking the dedicated animal for sacrifice on the altar, and then taking some of that blood up the stairs into the temple structure, whatever that was. The temple structure is missing here altogether. And inside that temple structure, making a sacrifice to the golden calf, to the god who lived inside. The priests, of course, knew that this was all drama. This is all play acting. There really was no God up there. The golden calf was not a god. They knew better than that. But the people didn't. This was all for public consumption. This was all propaganda. And the idea that Jeroboam had, which is not a bad idea, is to give the masses of people an alternative to a trip to Jerusalem. They had all been Israelites. And at one time, under David and Solomon, they had come to Jerusalem, to the tabernacle or to the temple several times a year for the feasts. Now, instead of going to Jerusalem, which would unite them again with their southern kingdom brothers, now they'll have a different place to go, to a temple in the north, to a temple farther south at Bethel. They have an alternative. So Jeroboam's work was primarily political. It was primarily propaganda. He was trying to build a separate nation, and it didn't work out very well, but these things often don't. There's that oak tree, and you can see the steps that lead up to the high place. At the very top, there isn't much to see, a few lines of stones in the gravel. The day that Donna and I took this group up there, it was a very wet day. It was raining hard, and we all got back on the bus soaking wet and shivering with the cold. It was a March day in Israel, and that often means cold weather. Certainly was this time around. The top of the platform was probably at one time paved, but we see evidence for some kind of a structure up there. We know there would have been a temple structure, but that temple structure is almost completely gone, and it's hard to pick it out. One last shot before we leave this batch of pictures is some sacred rooms alongside the temple, and often a variety of places. Archaeologists call these the sacred rooms. This was available for the priests. Maybe the priests slept here at night. We don't know for sure. This was the golden calf ritual would have been a fertility religion, and therefore it's entirely possible that the priests took prostitutes into these rooms. That would have been a very, very common occurrence in the non-Israelite religions. It's entirely possible that the Northern Kingdom went that route with their religion. It's very likely. At any rate, there's a lot of detail there. And as I've said before, that detail, lots and lots of trivial detail. Oh, let's see here, if I can find what I'm looking for. There it is. Sometimes these things are harder to find than you would expect them to be. Okay. Slideshow. Oh, goodness. Presenter view. There we go. Bingo. Okay. Okay. Rehoboam of Judah is an interesting guy. He is a very corrupt character. He was overly influenced by his contemporaries, other young men his same age. He didn't listen to the older counselors who had been alive during the time of Solomon. And because of that, he wasn't much of a king. He should probably have tried to reunify the country militarily. But frankly, the people of the North really didn't want to be reunited with the people of the South. They were tired of the taxes. They were tired of the oppression of a King Solomon, They knew that Rehoboam was no different. This is very similar to what's going on right now in the Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has a high-sounding rhetoric about reuniting the Russian people, when in fact the people of Ukraine don't want to be reunited with their Russian brothers. They don't want any part of it. They want to be their own independent nation. The northern tribes had always had an independent bent to them, and Rehoboam probably wanted to reconquer the area, but it would have been a very bad idea. So it just didn't happen. He didn't go into the north. His southern lands were repeatedly invaded by the Egyptians, most notably by a pharaoh named Shishak in 926 BC, who took at least Arad and Gazer and Gezer before sacking the temple and moving on into the north. So King Shishak was able to take both the southern and the northern kingdoms by surprise and loot and pillage wherever he wanted to. This photograph is a picture of a temple at Luxor in Egypt with cartouches of kings conquered by one of the pharaohs. There are a lot of these at Luxor, and this isn't particularly from the time of Rehoboam, but it's about that time. When Shishak went in and conquered, he looted Jerusalem, including the temple. It is very likely that Shishak took the furnishings of the temple at this time. That would include the Ark of the Covenant. So people who wonder what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, it's never mentioned after this time. It was probably not rebuilt. So where is the Ark of the Covenant? The Babylonians didn't brag about taking it. The Assyrians, of course, never had a chance. The Romans bragged about everything else they took. They had the temple menorah that they paraded through the streets of Rome, but they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant. I believe that very likely Shishak took the Ark of the Covenant back to Egypt with him, and there it was probably destroyed. It was the gold would have been melted down, and it would have been taken just as loot. Of course, if any of you have watched the Indiana Jones movies, you know that the Ark of the Covenant is actually in a big warehouse in Washington, D.C., but that probably isn't true. And the Nazis probably never got their hands on the Ark of the Covenant. I believe it was destroyed by Shishak or by his bureaucrats. So just a little bit here. Okay, Abijah. War continued between the north and the south. It was never particularly a big deal. Rehoboam's son Abijah tried to get up as far as Bethel. This photograph is some kids I was talking to near the Arab town of Baitin while we were out touring around looking at archaeological sites. Something I've discovered is that kids everywhere are essentially the same. They're curious. Some of them are just a little frightened, and some of them want to make friends, and some of them are kind of in the middle. Yeah, so it was kind of fun. I had enough Arabic that I was able to say, "Hi, what's your name?" And get a little bit of a conversation. But this little girl in the middle is the only one who would actually talk to me. And the little boy on the right, I tried to offer my hand for a fist bump, but he didn't want to do that. He wasn't sure who this big American was. But kids are the same all over the world. And really, if we teach children that other children are just like them, we could end war, but we never do it. We always keep them from playing with each other, and then eventually they go to war. I hate that. At any rate, King Abijah was not a good king. He tried to take Bethel. It didn't last. The city of Bethel was captured briefly by Abijah, and it could be that King Abijah destroyed the Dan temple in Bethel. If that's true, then we'd still expect to find the ruins, but we don't. Okay, King Asa of Judah is the king who followed Abijah. Asa was a relatively godly leader. He was a better king than either Rehoboam or Abijah. His troubles were numerous. He had war with Egypt, war with the northern kingdom, off and on. 1 Kings 15, we're told that Asa used his treasury, which would by this time probably not have been an enormous amount of money, but there was a lot to Asa, as a bribe to get the king of Syria to break a treaty with Israel, the northern kingdom, and become an ally with Judah. So ancient diplomacy is not all that different from modern diplomacy. So look, we'll give you 10,000 Patriot missiles if you will say this publicly about our enemies over here. You know, it's not much different. Bribes are made, and a huge bribe to Syria. The result of that particular bribe in 1 Kings 15 was a Syrian invasion of the northern regions of Galilee. Which was not a good thing. This photograph is of the Golan Heights in modern Israel. It doesn't look like much, but that's what that is. And there in the Golan Heights, you'll find things like this. In modern Israel, the kibbutzes, or farming communities, farming communes, really, co-ops that stretch along the line between Syria and Israel across the Golan Heights, are often set up as military outposts. And so under the netting there behind the barbed wire, you can probably make out the outlines of an old tank. That's not one of the modern Merkava tanks that the Israeli army has in large numbers. This is an older tank. This is probably the British Challenger, but still it would be a formidable piece of equipment if you've got a bunch of Bedouin terrorists swarming up out of the wilderness. Kibbutzes like this are planted along the border of modern Israel, especially way up in the Golan Heights, in order to to be a tripwire. The people who man these kibbutzes are families. These are men with wives and children. They have schools and stores and all of the usual things in a kibbutz, and they're right exactly on the front line. And if a war started, they would be the first to fight and very likely the first to die. And they're very, very motivated to defend their positions. And of course, the Syrians know that. They haven't been back in almost 50 years now. 1973 was the last time that Syria attempted an invasion of Israel. Okay, also here, there's the road into Syria. This is a picture of the United Nations checkpoint at the Syrian border on the road to Quneitra, and it is well and thoroughly blocked. There are berms and those concrete barriers, we call them Jersey barriers, and lots of signs in multiple languages saying, don't even think about coming this way. And in the little white building there is a United Nations guard. And I make it a point when I go past this place to stop and walk over close to the barriers and wave at the guy because he's a long way from home. How would you like a job like that? Manning the UN checkpoint at the Israel-Syria border. Not many people come along this road anymore. It was the main road, and this is the spot where the Israelis stopped the 1973 invasion. Okay, in the north, we've got a string of bad guys. The Northern Kingdom was a series of dynasties, often ending in assassination. Omri comes as the result of the assassination of the previous king, Zimri. So you've got Baasha, Elah, Zimri, and then Omri takes over. Omri and Ahab are the two major players in the Omride dynasty. Just those two. And after Ahab, it was all over. They're not very nice people. Omri came to power by assassination, 1 Kings 16. We're told that the followers of Omri were more powerful than the followers of Zimri, so Zimri died. And hardball politics in the ancient world. The capital of the Northern Kingdom at that time had been moved from Shechem, which is the city that you see here in this photograph, up to Samaria. Actually, it had been at Tirzah for a brief time, but Shechem was the old capital. The new capital was Samaria. I think I have some photographs of Samaria. But the new capital at Samaria, very interestingly, is on the west side of the watershed. Shechem is right at the crest of the mountains, and it can go either way. Tirzah was on the east side, facing toward Syria and the Transjordan and Mesopotamia. Samaria is on the side facing toward the Mediterranean. We know that during this period, there were significant interactions between Israel and people groups in Asia Minor and in the Greek islands and in Italy, even as far as Spain. We know that the Mediterranean was circled by trading vessels. So there was international trade, and we find in places like the archaeological site at Samaria, the various bits of pottery that show that Israel was trading with the Mediterranean world. Omri did that deliberately. He became a very wealthy king, so much so that uh, he was able to hold his own on the international stage. The biggest threat that Omri faced in the east was the rise of Assyria. Omri's dates around 876 or so BC. The Assyrian Kingdom in the north, I'll show you on a map in the next slide. The Assyrian Kingdom, some have called the first real attempt at a world empire. The Assyrians really weren't an empire. The Assyrians were a kind of a protection racket, like the mafia. Russia has a mafia. Italy has a mafia. Lots of countries have gangs that run protection rackets. The Assyrian Empire, quote unquote, or with an asterisk, ran a protection racket. They would show up outside the gates of the city with 100,000 soldiers and call on the king, saying, "Give us your loot and the best of your young men for slaves, and we'll leave you alone. Maybe we won't come back until next year. And if you don't give us all of your money and the best of your young men, we'll just burn your city down and kill everybody." And it would be a terrible thing if something like that happened. So you need to pay for our protection. The Assyrians were, frankly, a despicable people group. They came out of nowhere, took what they wanted, and left nothing but destruction and poverty in their wake. The Assyrians were really, really bad. And so I have real trouble calling them the first empire. The first real empire is probably Babylon, that comes after Assyria, after 612 BC, with the fall of Nineveh and then the destruction of their army. The Assyrians went out of business, and the Babylonians actually built roads and set up local governors and established a monetary system and a common market for trade. The Babylonians actually tried to set up an empire. So Assyria, however, is the problem through most of this early part. Most of the time during the divided kingdom, the kings of Israel and of Judah are going to be fighting with or trying to head off the Assyrians. This particular king is Shalmaneser. Okay. All right. In about 876, Ashurbanipal, one of the Assyrian kings, crossed the Euphrates, and this resulted in the subjugation of numerous cities. The Assyrian kings generally were terrorists, essentially. Israel itself wasn't bothered when Ashurbanipal came through, but they would be. The annals of the Assyrian entity in later days began to call Israel, the northern kingdom, Omri land, Bit Omri, house of Omri, literally, for the better part of 500 years. The inscriptions that we find in Mesopotamia speak of Israel, just as northern kingdom, as Omri land. So Omri was a very famous guy in the secular world, not so famous in the Bible. Omri gets a total of, I believe, 6 verses there in First Kings. He's a very bad man, and there's a nice note on Omri. It says, "As for all of the other works of Omri and all that he did and the things he built and the wars he fought, are they not written of in the chronicles of the kings of Israel?" In other words, it's a footnote. This is the Bible. We're trying to keep things somewhat uplifting. If you want to read about this bad man, go look it up in a book. so Omri just gets a footnote, even though he's the most famous king that Israel ever produced. Another important artifact of this era, let's see here. Oh, before I get on, this is the palace at Samaria. I know it doesn't look like much. It's a line of stones in the soil. And we call this the ivory palaces because we find, archaeologists found fragments of carved ivory that was used for paneling in this palace. This is the palace that Omri built. It's interesting that this place has never really been developed for tourism. If archaeologists were allowed to carefully excavate here and to restore some parts, to build pathways through the ruins, I'm quite sure that people interested in the Bible, Jewish and Christian tourists for sure, would come here. But this, of course, is in the Muslim-occupied territory. So it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to get back to Samaria. Dating to the same period is this little stone. This is called the Moabite stone, or sometimes the Misha Steely. Misha was the king of Moab around 870 or so BC. And the Bible gives very, very little information about the relationship of Moab and Israel, but we do know from First Kings that the people of Judah fought against the people of Moab and surrounded the capital of Moab, and the king of Moab, one Misha, sacrificed his firstborn son on the walls of the city in order to disgust the Israelites and make them go away. And that's what actually happened. That event is commemorated on this stele. This is written in the Moabite alphabetic script. It was found in the Transjordan near the Moabite capital and is presently in the museum in Paris, the Louvre. I was in the Louvre some years ago. It had been a long day, and I had been walking through the Louvre looking at art and other things, and came into a dark, not very interesting room with a couple of exhibits in it, and this stone tablet sitting in the middle on a little square box of a base, and there it is. And I recognized it immediately, because I've seen this for years. tried to do a transcription of it once from the textbook, but I recognized it immediately. This is the Misha Steely. And there it is. I, King Misha, faced off the hordes of the armies of Judah. I defeated them by the power of my might, and in commemoration, I sacrificed my own son on the walls of the city and watched the enemies of my people run in fear. A terrible story. And yet the Misha Steely provides a precise corroboration of the biblical story. And the Bible just mentions it in passing. I believe it gets one verse, but there it is. This is, again, what I call a trivial detail. How do we know that the stories in the Old Testament are true? Well, where we can check them out, they exactly fit the historical, archaeological, geographical details. There's a lot of stuff we can't check out, but what we can check out checks, which is part of the fun. This map will help you see the relative shape of the Assyrian Empire. You notice Assyria is the northern part of the Mesopotamian Valley. The southern part is mostly Babylon. The very southern part around modern Basra is called Sumer. And the Assyrians took all of that area and came up and over the top and all the way down the coast with all of Israel, all of the Sinai, and they controlled Egypt and apparently controlled some significant chunks of the Arabian Peninsula. The Assyrians, well, as I mentioned, they would send out raiding parties, large armies on an annual basis in every direction to collect tribute, bribes, protection money. They were just a bad group. Egypt and the Mesopotamian powers prior to this time, before the Assyrian Empire, could be thought of as great powers. So we've got the Mitanni, the Old Babylonian Empire, the Elamites, the Medians, the Parthians. All of these groups were, to some extent or another, great powers, and that they could project an army. And these great powers, like Egypt and let's say Babylon, would relate diplomatically. They would marry one another's daughters and so on. But prior to about 900 BC, this never made up a single empire. It was the Assyrians who first made the attempt at getting a single large co-prosperity sphere. And the idea was they would have the prosperity and everybody else would serve them. That didn't go over very well. They were broadly hated. One of the first really big wars in the history of the world took place at a place called Karkar. And on this map, you'll find Karkar spelled with a pair of Q's, Q-A-R, Q-A-R, on the Mediterranean coast, just below the little tag that says Shalmaneser III defeats a coalition including Aram and Ahab the Israelite in about 853. BC. So Ahab got in on that war. Ahab was the son of Omri, and he was a really, really bad man. We know that he participated in the Battle of Karkar, and at that time, the coalition was defeated. Later on, there's going to be another battle that will not come out quite so well. Let's see what I've got here. Okay, Ahab, good old Ahab. Ahab succeeded Omri in about 874, and he specialized in apostasy. He was a thoroughly evil character. His headquarters in the north was a site we call Jezreel. This overlooks the Jezreel Valley, and you can see the valley off in the distance. The ruins in the foreground belong to Ahab and Jezebel. And this is a look down into the British excavation at Jezreel. Elijah fits into this period as an opponent for Ahab. And Elijah is very important because his ministry can be thought of along with Elisha as a polemic or rhetorical argument against Baal worship. Ahab gave himself wholeheartedly to the worship of the pagan god Baal, the environmentalist wacko god. Ahab and Jezebel lived in Jezreel when they weren't in Samaria. And there's a lot of details of the biblical story that are confirmed here in the ruins of Jezreel. Karkar was the battle that where Ahab fielded the second largest army of the 60,000 man coalition of kings that opposed the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. Ahab died later at the Battle of Ramoth Gilead, this time facing the Syrians. Let's see, here is Antioch in the north. It's very near the battlefield of Karkar. Elijah, and this is Mount Carmel. The statue there is fairly recent. That was put up by the Christian monastery that operates at the top of the mountain. We call it the Mukraka. It's an Arabic name. And from the top, you get a nice view of the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo, and a bunch of other stuff. Elijah fits exactly into this period. He was raised up by God at a particular point in history to oppose the rise of Baal and Asherah worship. The dramatic events of Elijah's life fit very well into this period, and there's lots of archaeology to help us see what's going on there. The prophets Elijah and Elisha took a major part in the training of young men in what we call the school of the prophets that lasted up until the time of Jehu. So for a period of roughly 100 years, the northern kingdom provided a home for wandering schools of prophets. These men would in turn pass that on to others. And this prophetic office is going to become the basis of the Old Testament prophets. Elijah and Elisha didn't write anything, but their disciples did. And it's the prophetic work that actually produces most of the historical books of the Old Testament outside of the Pentateuch. So Elijah, a very, very important point in the movement. Let us go on to a little bit of a summary. During the divided kingdom, we're going to see an increasing influence by foreign powers. During the time of David and Solomon, the foreign powers were mostly on the downside. They were not very important. But Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, and Syria all gain greater and greater influence and become more and more important. As we mentioned, all of Israel's kings were evil. Judah's were mixed. We have some good guys and some bad guys, and that's going to go all the way through. I'll make one last note about the chronology of the kings of Israel and Judah that is worth knowing, I think. When we read the books of the Kings and the books of the Chronicles, we're always going to be a little confused by the numbers. If you try to add up the numbers of the lengths of reign, at how old the king was when he gave birth to, or when the next king in line was born, how old he was when he took office, you'll find that things don't work out very well, and the numbers are often confusing. About 100 years ago, a man by the name of Edwin Teely wrote a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, in which he demonstrated two really important points. In both the northern and the southern kingdom, the kings often had a co-regency, particularly in the south, so that one king would not wait until his death before getting the next king ready to go. And so there was an overlap of kings. And sometimes that's not completely clear, but the Bible always assumes that. The other thing is that the dating of the kings was handled in a different way between the North and the South. They used different patterns, different systems for assigning the years of their king. Whether it's a session year or a regnal year. The Assyrians used an accession year method, and so the northern kingdom tended to use an accession year. So if the king, let's say the king started his work in April of 26, okay, that became year one of the reign of so-and-so. Okay, year one of Ahab. And the following year that began with the Jewish New Year began year two. So we've had a year that went for several months and so on. So, okay, so that's the accession year method. The regnal year method counts the first year from 0 to year 1 from the month that the king began to reign. And that was the method used in Egypt. The kings of Judah count their years that way. Because of the different counting and the overlapping, the numbers of the Hebrew kings are often difficult. And some critics have said, oh, you can never trust the Bible because just look at the numbers for the Hebrew kings. They're always wrong. And indeed they are, if you're looking for some kind of a modern pattern. But it's not a modern pattern, it's an ancient pattern, and it makes very good sense if you look at it that way. So that's what we're going to do for today. On Wednesday, we'll finish up the divided kingdom. There's a whole bunch more detail, tons of detailed things going on. I hope this is helpful, and we'll try to keep at it on Wednesday. I'm going to unmute everybody. It's time for us to say goodbye. Guys, I appreciate having everybody here. Your attention is a real encouragement to me. I look forward to the time that we can start traveling back to Italy and the Philippines and see you all in person again. It's like we're developing a relationship that could be a friendship if we work at it. And I'm looking forward to getting back together with everybody again. So we'll see you on Wednesday, and we'll continue looking at a whole bunch more archaeology. God bless everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr.
John.
John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, hey, Joe. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. John.
See you
Good
guys.
night.
Bye-bye,
Good
Oscar.
night, everyone.
Grazie.
Thanks now.